Now welcome to this video on W.D.Gann's angle rules, and I've called it So You Think You're Doing Gann. Now if you go to YouTube in your browser and you put Gary IDS in, you'll see a list of the videos that I've already done, and it would probably be useful to understand what an angle is by watching one of the videos I've done called Gann Angles, the Basics. And you'll also probably find the other angle video I've done called Angle Lesson Number 2, which is an example of doing it correctly. But what I'm trying to show you here is that if you use Gann angles, and you're probably using some free software that you've got, then actually what you're doing is actually completely and utterly wrong. Now this is some free software that I've got, which came with my currency account that I use for trading currencies, and what you've got here is a weekly high and low chart of the S&P 500, and pretty much every piece of software that does technical analysis will have an option called a Gann Fan, and you can see it here as Add Gann Fan. And the idea is you go to a high, so that's a major high in 2007, and then you line up, say, the 1 by 1 angle, which Gann said was his most important one. So there it says 1 by 1, and you line it up with a high. Well, there's obviously an important high there, so if I line it up with that high, what I've got on here is I've got a Gann Fan. Now if we look at this, first of all, it looks pretty confusing, but does it really work? Well, you can see here it doesn't really work, it doesn't really work here, but then you can say, it gave me the high here, and it gave me the actual top that was made here. Now on this weekly chart, look closely, can you see that I think it's a 3 by 1 there, can you see that it goes through the 3 by 1 slightly, and it doesn't quite get to the 4 by 1. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change that to a daily chart. So this is the daily chart. Now I showed you that on the other chart that the 3 by 1 it broke it by a bit. Now on this daily chart that I've just changed to, the angle has moved, it's actually gone higher, and on the other one I showed you that it almost hit the 4 by 1, but now I've changed it to the daily chart. You can see it's nowhere near the 4 by 1. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start zooming out, or zooming in on this chart. Now watch the position of the angles to the position of the price. Now, sorry, go the other way. So as I zoom in, what you should be able to see is that 3 by 1 is getting further away from that top. And as I keep going, it's getting further and further and further and further and further away. And in fact, the angles are actually moving relative to the prices. I can't say this strongly enough. That has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with what W.D.Gann wrote. The angle should be in exactly the same position relative to the prices, no matter how we squeeze the prices in or we squeeze the prices out. Okay, the angles do not move at all. And the point I'm trying to make here is that if you think you're doing Gann and you're using this software that does something called a Gann Fan, then basically you are not doing Gann. It is complete rubbish. Okay, so this is the software that I have wrote, and this is the S&P 500, and we're going to do basically the same thing, but we're going to do what Gann literally said in his works. Now I think that Gann actually told you just enough to work it out for yourself if you're willing to put the hard work into doing it. And if you read what Gann physically said, and you've watched that video that I showed you at the beginning of this about basic angles, he tells you that this, well, in this particular case this is a weekly chart, and in that basic video thing I showed you, then Gann said his most important angle was a 1 by 1, and we're going to do it down from that high, so it'll be one that goes down 1 point in this case every week, and that's what people will tell you is Gann's most important angle, if they're doing it the way it should be. But as I've already shown you, most people don't do angles correctly, they do them completely and utterly wrong. The next one below that one, it would be, according to Gann, would be a minus 2 by 1. The next one would be a minus 4 by 1. The next one would be a minus 8 by 1, and that is a Gann Fan. But in this particular case, because I've wrote the software, those angles are in a certain position, and it doesn't matter if I change to a daily chart, the angles will still be in exactly the same position relative to the prices. So if you look at that little bit there, for instance, if I reduce the time period and scroll back a little bit, it is in exactly the same position no matter how I change the distance between the prices. But if we go back to the weekly chart, I mean, if we actually look at that, I think we've got to say it just doesn't work. You could say it kind of gave you that first reaction there, but when it got to here, it broke it. Now, that doesn't look like a lot on a weekly chart, but if you were looking at a daily chart, it's a massive rise. Then people would show you that it gave you this low here and it gave you this low here, but then it doesn't work here and it hasn't given you the highs that we've just physically made. And well, it just doesn't work. So if you do what Gann literally said you do, and you've got software that does it correctly, which is very dubious, as I've already shown you, then it doesn't work. Now, if you listen to what Gann says, he says that he mentions something called a master time factor, and basically what he's saying is that everything works in its own unique way, and the S&P is no different. So this is, if the chart you're seeing here is literally doing what Gann physically says you should do in his courses when you're drawing angles. Now, I know what the master time factor is for the S&P future, which I've hidden. Now, if you're willing to do the hard work, you can work it out for yourself. But if we take off those angles, and I've changed the master time factor to the way it should work. Now, I showed you before -1 by 1 and -2 by 1 and -4 by 1 and -8 by 1, which are Gann's major angles. Now, I've changed the master time factor. Now, if I do a 1 by 1 with the master time factor changed, you can see that it's now a very flat line. Now, that is not, as Gann would say, his most important angle. It's too flat. So the way I start off doing all this is, most people say that Gann angles have got something to do with 45 degrees, which is actually a complete load of rubbish. It's really all to do with the scale that you're actually using. But let's do the way I start all doing this is I try a 1 by 1, I try a 2 by 1, I try a 4 by 1. What I'm doing is before I can see the future, so let's say that I can only see the bottom there, and I do a -4 by 1, and Gann's next one is a -8 by 1, and the next one is a -16 by 1. I look for the one that looks roughly about 45 degrees because I just need somewhere to start, and depending on the scale that you've got down the side, it will differ on different items. So a currency, it might be a 1 by 16 instead of one that goes down 16 points per time period. But that's somewhere to start. So twice 16 is 32. Now the 32 by 1 gives us that first reaction that was made here. Now most people who do Gann would keep that line on for the future, and what it does, it makes it very confusing. As soon as you break through an angle, you cut it. And it broke through the angle here, so I've cut the angle. Incredibly important. All that happens is you start fitting lines in to see what you want to see in the future. The next major angle above an 8 is 16 is half 16, which is an 8 by 1. I do half that number, which is a 4 by 1. So I put those angles on. I can put those angles on in the middle of 2008 once I know I've got an important high, and those are points in the future where the market might turn down if it gets there. Now, I don't know how it's going to get there or when it's going to get there, but I'm only going to make the trade if it gets there. So I can't go and say it's going to hit the 16 by 1 on the 19th of August 2012 or something. All I say is if it gets there in the future, it's a point to short the market, or make a decision to short the market, should I say. Now, if we go forward on this and see what it does at one of Gann's major angles, it actually reaches the 16 by 1 angle at this point here. Now notice what happens. The market suddenly falls. So out of the blue, and at the time the news was incredibly good, there was no bad news, and all of a sudden the market suddenly goes down. What you'll then find is that some news event about halfway down will come out to kind of explain why the market's going down, which people will accept, but it's not the real reason. The real reason is because it hit the Gann angle. So let's see what happens next. Market goes back up again, goes through the angle, so we cut the angle, which is very important, and the market suddenly goes shooting down. And that was the flash crash. Now the flash crash didn't happen, the exact top, the flash crash happened about 3 weeks later than the actual physical high was made. But the reason it went down is because it hit another Gann angle. It hit the angle that's halfway between the 16 and the 8. So what you do is you add 16 to 8, which gives you 24, and divide by 2 to get halfway between the two, and you get a 12. And that is the angle that's between 16 and 8. Notice that the distance, even though I've said that that is the angle that's halfway between the two, notice that the distance from here to here is not the same as from here to here. But it's actually further here than it is here. So even though that number is halfway between 8 and 16, 12, it isn't physically halfway. And that's what makes all this very clever. Okay, well actually I can also put on that, I can also put on the angle that's halfway between 8 and 4 for the future. Because I had the 12 on before it ever got there, of course. So I would also be watching the minus 6 by 1 for a potential trade. So let's see what happens. Well, the flash crash happens. The flash crash didn't just happen. Like I said, it happened about 3 weeks later than the actual top of the physical high was made. In fact, I actually shorted the market there. I didn't short the market here. I didn't short the market here, or here, or here, or here. I shorted it here. I didn't do the S&P, by the way. I did the FTSE. The market then goes up. Now, you never trade it again. One of the big mistakes people make is they trade trend lines. Now, sometimes they work, but the vast majority of times they don't. Now, the great thing about angles is they're not trend lines. You put these mathematical lines on before the market ever gets there. But once that high is made, anybody who's got a ruler will put a trend line through there, through that high, and will be looking to short it here. And that is not a trade. Never trade what other people can see. Anyway, market goes up, has a reaction, but then it reaches the 8 by 1. Now the 8 by 1 actually did work, but it only worked for a few days. Then it reaches the 6 by 1. Now the last major turning point was 12. Half of 12 is 6. And the next major high was made on 6. And I did short it there as well. Now, when I say I shorted it here and I shorted it here, I didn't short it anywhere else in between. So, let's see what happens next. Well, we've got one for the future, which is a 4. But there's a less important angle that's halfway between 8 and 12. Now, it's 10. So if you add 8 and 12 and divide by 2, you get a minus 10 by 1. Now, one of the options in the software is to make that a weak line, just to remind me that it's not a major angle, so I'm not really expecting a major turn. But it did work, and it lasted for about a month. The market actually went round. Halfway between 6 and 4 is 5. Again, I'd probably make it a weak line. And let's see what happens when it gets to that one. Again, I wouldn't trade it the second time. So you've got the 6 by 1 it hits, but I wouldn't trade it here. You can see it actually works, and it works for about 3 weeks, but it didn't go very far. It's a mug's play. Anybody who's got a ruler would draw a line from there through that high there and would be looking to shorts on the trend line. Don't trade trend lines. And then we hit the 5 by 1, and the 5 by 1 is the reason why the market went down. And that's what the chart looks like today. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change it to a daily chart to show you that the angles are in exactly the same position relative to the prices. So the 12 by 1 worked back here to give us this high that it made here. It broke the 10 very slightly, but no matter how I change the time period, the angles are in the same position relative to the chart. It stopped on the 8 by 1, and I was pretty close to shorting it, but I didn't quite. If I would have done it, I would have had a stop loss just above that angle, and I would have taken a small loss here. But I was looking for a bit more weakness here, but it didn't show it, so I didn't end up getting in. And then it hits the 6 by 1, which just happens to be exactly where the market turns. Now with hindsight, all this is dead easy. You just look at the chart and you can see it goes down, and you say, well, I would have done that. But you've got to remember what it looked like to you at the time. At the time, the market looked like that, and if I didn't have that angle on, then it all looks fantastic. It looks like it's going to go on forever, and the news you can guarantee will be absolutely fantastic. However, when you put the angle on, things look slightly different, and the market suddenly falls very, very quickly. Again, that's what I showed you on the weekly chart, the trend line. It's now a trend line, that's not a trade. And you can see that it went down, encouraging people to short the market on the trend line for about 2 weeks, and then in one day it all disappeared. It went shooting back up again if you would have shorted the market. And then it hit the 5x1 to give us exactly where the next top's made. And then we have some angles for the future. You can do the same thing from lows to get buying opportunities. Now it's a bit difficult from the lows. It took me a bit of time to work it out, but it still works unbelievably well. But it's not quite as simple as using Gann's basic angles. There are other numbers that I've actually discovered that work. Anyway, just thought I'd show you that if you think you're doing Gann, you probably aren't. Hope you enjoyed it. Now, of course, don't just take my word for it. Try it out for yourself. If you've got some software that is meant to do Gann angles, then try and reproduce what you can see of this chart of the S&P, and you might be able to do it, but I doubt very much you can produce what I've actually done. If you'd like more information about our services, then there's a website which you'll see a caption for in a second, and you can contact me at the email address below.